Today we're going to be going over lying down poses, as you just saw there, with an emphasis on the female form. And now what I just want to say straight off the bat is that lying down poses might be a little more difficult than you think. There's a lot that go on sometimes. So in order to make this a little simpler, I came up with 6 rules. We're going to call them the 6 rules of Josh for lying down poses that might help us along the way. Rule number 1, find your halfway line. So for lying down poses, finding the halfway point is pretty important. Now, some of you might have been asking, how do you find the halfway point, right? How do you do that without taking out a ruler or doing some sort of boring process? And realistically, my tip is to just use your hand. With your hand, you can pinch it, you can open it as wide as you can. So let's say, for instance, in this example, I thought that right here at the waistband was the halfway point. So I can close my fingers together, and then doing my best to keep my fingers at this exact width, I'm just going to take them over to the other side and put my finger right where I thought that halfway point was. And I'm going to check, and I'm going to see right here that obviously that wasn't the correct halfway point. So easy enough, we just go back to the start, we open up our fingers a little wider. So this time I'm going to say right around here. And so I'm going to remember my finger was right around this mark here. So we're going to drag our finger over to the side, and we're going to try to keep it as wide as we can, right around, centered on the finger. And then we can see right over here that we about line up with the foot. And to me, that's honestly good enough. We found a decent halfway point. I do want to really kind of emphasize with this, it's not about finding the perfect, amazing matching halfway point. It's about getting an idea. So why is finding the halfway point on a lying down pose so important? Well, if we think back to our normal proportions and we think about how the halfway point is usually right at the bottom of the crotch, or that halfway point where the bony landmark of the great trochanter is sticking out from the hips, this is usually the halfway point. Now in this picture, it is. But if we look at other pictures, we're going to see that that is not exactly how it works. So if you take a look at a couple more pictures, you can see sometimes it lines up, sometimes it doesn't. Usually it kind of depends on how extreme of an angle you're looking at. And with lying down poses, you often get extreme angles. Rule number 2, check for foreshortening. An easy way to identify foreshortened poses is when you have a pose like this from an extreme angle. So what do I mean by extreme angle? Well, we're not seeing all of the body that is underneath her here, right? Because she's laying down and we're aligned with her, so everything is being covered up by another body part. So realistically, in this picture, all we see other than the arms is we see a head, we see a little bit of an indication of her shoulder. We can kind of figure out that her rib cage, the top of her rib cage, is somewhere around here. We don't see her back, we don't see her butt, we don't see anything leading up to that. We don't even see her upper thigh. We just immediately go straight in to a little bit of her leg, and then mainly finishing off at the foot. So not all foreshortened poses are the same. So you do have ones like this where we're looking at a different angle. It's still an extreme angle though. So everything is kind of covered up by her chest area right here. And then what you're seeing is a little bit of like an indication of the leg. Now, again, these are kind of reasons that I really like these poses, because a lot of stuff is hidden, and as long as you can figure out that perspective in your head, it's really easy. With foreshortened poses, you really want to remember that it is all about perspective, right? So we do want to understand that we have something in front, and then we have something that could be considered the middle ground, and then eventually the background, and it could all be a part of the same person or object or whatever you're drawing. So kind of understanding too the size variation, where like how big is this hand versus how big is the head, is something that's really going to kind of give truth to your foreshortened drawing. Lastly, just to note, there are pictures that aren't from super extreme angles still have foreshortening. You still have things going on here where the rib cage is finishing here and the pelvis is beginning here because of the angle we're looking at. And just like in this picture here, you are seeing an extreme foreshortening in terms of how big the head is versus how big the rest of the body is, because one thing is closer to the camera than the other. So these are things to look out for in foreshortened pictures, which happen a lot when you're looking at laying down poses. Rule number 3, line of action. So I'm not really going to go into this one too much, because if you guys have followed my videos, you already know. So here's a couple examples just to show you. Rule number 4, stealing angles. Whether you've heard of stealing or taking an angle, it's something that becomes very vital when we are talking about laying down poses, because Generally, when we tend to draw, if we start with the head and we start to work our way down the body, we're going to start kind of straightening out our pictures naturally without even thinking about it. So one thing you could do is to steal a line where you understand that from here to here, it's actually on a diagonal. It's not going to be straight up and down because that would give us here, and that would put the butt or the hips all the way down here, and you're going to have a different pose. So again, stealing angles kind of helps with that perspective, and you can also always just think about these things in a taper. So just a couple more examples of using the angles that we see in the picture. So it's just kind of something you want to look at the reference and then bring over and apply back to your picture. And sometimes it helps you find like an inner shape within the picture that sometimes if the picture, the pose is too dynamic, you can't figure out how to fit it on your page. Finding that shape sometimes helps you figure it out a little better. Rule number 5, use overlapping to your advantage. This one might sound kind of obvious, but sometimes it really isn't. And the reason I put this in there, and I didn't just kind of include this in the foreshortened picture, is because sometimes we just overlook this, but you want to remember that there's objects that are overlapping things, which is why you can't see something. So here we have the head, which is completely overlapping the shoulders and the rest of the rib cage, and down the lower back to the hips to the leg. You have the back and the head really blocking all that, and then finally you see this shape. So what's happening there is all overlap. So understanding that is really important when it comes to kind of identifying what's happening. I don't want to get this confused though with the idea that overlap only exists in a foreshortened picture, because that's not necessarily true. If you look here, what's happening to the other side of the hip? What happened to that other leg? Where's her other arm? Right? And you have so much more overlap happening, because generally when you're looking at laying down poses, and we think of laying down poses as looking at someone from a side view, not typically an up and down bird's eye view here, there's so much information that's going to be getting lost, just like when you draw a person from the side or a profile view. So understanding that, even though this is the only part of the hips here, we see that there is another part behind it, right? It goes back into 3D space if we were to kind of figure out how that's looking, right? So we always want to be thinking of that part, and it's also going to help us to really understand too and place our pose when we look at certain things like how this shoulder is completely overlapping and covering up any sign of her neck, which is probably somewhere down here, but again, it's being overlapped and covered. Rule number 6, twist and shout. Often with laying down poses, you're going to get some sort of twist or variation going on as people kind of tend to move and get comfortable. So what I mean by this is, if you look at these two pictures, we have very, very similar poses going on. They're in the same spot, they're doing the same thing, but one's a little more interesting if you ask me, and it's going to be this one right here. And the reason being is for the twist happening. Now what I mean by twist is, here's her rib cage that is facing forward towards the ground or the book or whatever you think it's looking towards. Now we get to see a little bit of this twist and distortion on her pelvic box there, which is actually coming more facing towards us in a 3D plane. So that's the twist that's happening, whereas opposed everything to here is just kind of facing down towards the floor in around the same direction. Now we're not going to talk too much about that in this video because I wanted to keep it kind of general, but if you do happen to be interested in learning about twisting the form, I happen to have a video about that. Alright, before we start, I just want to say, for my people out there that get frustrated very easily when a drawing doesn't go right the first time, heads up, full disclosure, lying down poses can be a very frustrating first time experience. But don't let that scare you away, just have fun with it, keep it simple, and try your best, and I promise the more miles you put in on this, the better you'll get. So this is just going to be a classic gesture drawing session here. I didn't want to go too far into detail, and I wanted to keep us on a timer so that way we get through some poses. I want us to have, a diversity of poses and figure out how these all work. So one that we broke down already, looking at a foreshortening pose. Now again, use the overlapping to your advantage. You have less to draw, so use that to your advantage. So how I started here is I started with the head, and then I just kind of gave myself a line above the head, so that kind of found me the halfway point, and I was able to use that halfway point to find the bottom where the arms should about be. Is this going to give me a perfect lineup? Probably not, but it gives me good enough. From here you can already see my poses taking shape, and I still have over a minute, so I'm just kind of shaping some things. Again, try to jump around from spot to spot to get everything in the pose that you want to get in. But another reason that I want to do these time things is because it gives you less time to think, and it kind of forces you to really see what's in front of you and just put it down on the paper. A lot of the videos I looked up on YouTube when I was thinking about doing a video like this was a really long form of a single pose, and you don't really get anything out of that, you know? Here, I'm going to show you a solid collection of poses, and you're going to draw with me, and we're going to figure them out together, and we're going to learn as we draw these. So here I'm drawing the feet, and that little bit of the leg too, right? And so really we don't see that much. I'm just seeing kind of a little bit of the calf down to the ankle, and then we get a nice kind of display of like the bottom of the feet. So you can play around with, I like to do like a circle when I'm doing kind of like the ball of the heel there. And then really they're just kind of like nice wedge shapes. And the more you kind of play with this shape, the more fun it looks, and you really have a nice solid foot feeling. All right, on to the next one. So sorry if these pictures are a little small. I just had to make sure I had room to fit in my full lying pose. So for this one, I'm using line of action, definitely because I really want to capture that curve going on in her body. You know, that rib cage is kind of like it's being propped up, but then we have her hips on to the table or the surface, whatever she's laying on. So these are really good points to kind of notice. Now with laying down poses, especially like this, where we can see the majority of the body, you know, from the shoulder to the legs, you want to make sure that everything is about on the same plane. We're a little bit lower than her in perspective, so we almost don't even see the bottom of, you know, like a little bit of the hip, some of the leg. So you want to make sure that from the elbow that's leaning on the table, we have some weight distributed on the table right there, right? To the knees, it's about on the same plane, the same line. Now this doesn't mean that the line has to be straight left to right on a perfect, you know, axis there. There can be a diagonal to it, and to me I saw a diagonal, so I put it there. Now again, from this point I'm just kind of stealing the angles, placing things down, and seeing how I like it. I'm not getting too caught up in all of these with the halfway point. You guys see I did layer the halfway point over the picture there for you guys, so a little cheat sheet. But I'm not always going to refer to that if I don't feel it's necessary. Again, this is gesture drawing. Proportions are great. They're there, they exist. Try to aim for them, but you don't have to get them every time to get a pretty solid drawing going. So once you get that pose kind of figured out, you can go in and add a little bit more detail. As we get going, we're going to get a little bit longer with these poses, so don't worry if 2 minutes seems a little too fast for you right now. We got two 2-minute poses to go, and then we're going to get a little longer in time. All right, next pose, flat on the back. So this is one where you really want to kind of emphasize that straight line left to right for this one, to really have a sense of weighted feeling onto the table or the surface, the bed, the table, whatever you want to turn this into. So it just feels like the body is planted there. You don't want to have a feeling of the body's kind of hovering or falling or anything like that. So again, having a nice solid line can help you really place your figure. From here, I just kind of drew the head, everything I'm keeping nice and loose, right? This is what gesture drawing is all about. And I just thought, you know, like the length of my rib cage, throw that in there. Maybe what does the pelvic box look like, and in like simple form shapes. And then I can start drawing in the close. Now, a fun thing with laying down poses that I find is that close is actually really helpful. Now, you're not often going to hear me say that when we're talking about figure drawing in terms of finding a pose or figuring things out. But close provides wraparounds, and it kind of gives us really good hints as to where certain things kind of wrap around, which direction they're going, where you see a twist and where you see a bend. So when it comes to laying down poses, I actually think that having close figures can be something that's more beneficial and helpful, especially if you don't have people wearing, you know, any kind of extravagant clothes or something like that, because that's always going to make things more complicated. So remember, at these, we're trying to focus on the laying down pose, so get that laying down story first. You know, she has a whole holding a knife kind of story going on. To me, the arms aren't really as important to get through into this picture because I wanted to have the solid feeling of her laying there on her back down first, And then if I had more time, I would come in with the arms, but make sure you get that solid feeling of what's happening first. So not my favorite view when we're thinking about laying down poses, but this is a view that happens, so this might be something that could happen in whatever you're drawing. We kind of have a bird's eye view as if we're standing over the person that is laying down. Now, the reason I don't like this is because typically when I think about drawing someone who's lying down, I think about drawing them from, being on the same angle as they are, maybe a little above, a little below. Here's a more of an extreme angle. That being said, still a great pose to learn from because you never know when you're going to need to use a pose like this. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, I tried this pose a couple times because it just wasn't working for me. I tried it with the line of action. I tried stealing some angles, which of course I'm still using in certain ways. But kind of just going freeform on this one was the most helpful for me. And then coming back in and just kind of like fixing some things if I had the time. There's just kind of like some interesting twists and curves and like overlapping that's going on in here. Like the chest is kind of overlapping the arm, but then the rib cage and the lat muscle comes forward. It's like an interesting pose where we're seeing just some interesting overlapping shapes. I don't know a better word for it. But again, we're here for gesture drawing to get through the pose, to kind of figure it out and to learn from it. So if this is one that you are getting stuck on, like I got stuck on a few times, don't let it frustrate you. Just try your best and kind of lay it down. So from here, it would have helped too if I started adding in some details of maybe some folded fabric underneath her, or the pillow, or some sort of a resemblance of like a ground surface, because what I noticed is as I started finishing this pose, it kind of looks like she's free falling or in some sort of form. It doesn't look like she's on the ground. So something like that could have helped me push this. We are on to our 3-minute drawings now. So there's going to be three 3-minute drawings. So enjoy the extra time, take that breather, right? Some of these could be frustrating. Now I'm going to just be straight up honest. This was the hardest out of any of the drawings that we took on today. Sorry if the picture's small, by the way. I just kind of had to make sure I had room. What's going on here is some extreme foreshortening and some extreme perspective. You don't see it, but if we look at some of the line breakdown that I did on the picture, mid-thigh, if we're looking at that thigh that's closest to us, mid-thigh, if not a little lower, is the halfway point. That's not what we see as the halfway point if we're looking at someone from like a normal angle, right? A regular angle. So when we have poses like this, it helps me to break it down even further. So that's why I have the red line being my halfway. And then I found the halves of the halves, right? So we have some quarters in here. And it really helps me to kind of figure out like, okay, you have this rib cage ending and then boom, right in front, the pelvic box kind of comes in play with the glutes and it's just kind of completely covering that section. But one side is compressed, one side is stretched. And you get all this like interplay between like the body parts going on, and it can be very confusing, but really fun at the same time too if you let yourself play with this. Now, what I found the most hard in this picture was to really let myself get huge with that leg coming towards us. You don't really realize it, but that leg, if you put your finger from the foot all the way to the butt and you move that up, it's about double the length of the rest of her body. So while it doesn't look like that, that's what's happening in this picture, and you got to be able to kind of come in and emphasize that as you can. So one thing you can do for these extreme angles is to kind of really make that foot a little bit bigger than you think. The foot has to be bigger than the head for sure. Naturally, the foot is generally going to be the same size as the head anyway, so really play it up if you can. The bigger, the better here. And then you kind of start to piece these things together a little bit. So you can see my angles are straight in a lot of these places because I'm stealing my angles, right? Of course, I can come back in and curve these out later, but kind of just getting the right angle going in the beginning is going to be the best stepping off point in terms of finding and figuring out this pose for adding information to later. Now, with a little bit of time, I was able to add in the arm, kind of give it another plane, and it kind of helps to really drive home that perspective point. And then if I had more time, I'd be able to finish the head. So don't let this one deceive you. I know it looks pretty plain and regular, but if you look how much of that foot that is away from us and that leg that is away from us that we're seeing, there's quite an extreme foreshortening and perspective going on here. Keep that in mind, okay? You have a head that is almost bigger than her entire hip box and leg section if you were to, cut out her head and just put it over that section. These are things you want to keep in mind when you're drawing this picture. Now from here, we have that in mind so we know what we're doing. Again, with this picture, I figured it was complicated, so I added in the halfway, and I got the halves of the halves, okay? So if you need those, if that helps you out, perfect. If not, they're there for whoever wants them. So I was figuring out this picture basically by kind of like looking back and forth on my reference, of course, and just kind of seeing where things line up. Does the chest go as high as the chin? If not, I try to keep it lower than the chin. Does the rib cage to the pelvis, is it a straight line? Does it have a diagonal? Not really. Where I'm seeing that diagonal is what I'm drawing right now, which is where the waist goes to the back, and then also where the waist meets the hips. You get a pretty solid diagonal there. Now this is another reason why I was saying earlier that clothes is really helpful in finding some of these angles, because you can see all these wraparounds that I'm going to kind of start using to my advantage right now to really just kind of push the point that we are looking down this person. We're kind of looking from over this person's head in a way. Not so extreme, right? It's not an extreme angle, but there are some extremes to it. So these really drastic wraparounds where I'm giving it a really nice curve, those are to help drive home the point that we're looking down at this person. All right, from here, we kind of have the angle of the pose figured out, so we really get to just play with figuring out the rest. So I took a line off of the bottom of the butt to figure out where the foot went, because the foot's not as low as the butt. Again, it's going off into perspective. It can't be. It's got to follow that diagonal. From here, I would honestly say you guys could choose if you want to or not to add that foot that we see in the background. If you have the time, add it. If you don't. It's something that you could probably get away with not adding in there if you wanted to, because if she just opened up her legs a little more to like the side, her entire front leg there would be covering it. So again, these are the ways that I'm saying use overlapping to your advantage if you can. Two more poses to go, guys. So this is our last 3-minute, a little more of a standard pose. We do have a little bit of an angle going on, okay? What I mean by that is we want to realize that technically her shoulder and rib cage is a little bit closer to us than if we go down to her knee. It's on a little bit of an angle, okay? So try to incorporate that just by thinking about it. Sometimes if you don't, force it, it'll work. See how it works for you. Here I'm just kind of starting this like a standard figure drawing for myself, and for me the back of the neck area, like the back of the shoulder to going down the rib cage to where it kind of meets the waist there, a little confusing to me, just because you kind of have this weight bearing arm that's being pushed up a little bit. You have a little bit of like a scapular retraction there, so I was just kind of going back and forth stealing that angle from my picture. Of course, using my clothing wraparounds to really kind of drive home that point of what's happening there. I have a compression going on. Okay, her bottom half is being stretched, her back going into her hips, and her pelvis is fully compressing. So you want to show that, and clothing can really help you show that with like the wrinkles and folds. We don't have to get super detailed like my fold videos, but you do want to show some sort of an indication if you can, because it'll help you out in the long run. Now, before I got too into detail with what was going on the leg here, I did start figuring out some of these details, but I wanted to figure out that angle. Remember I was talking about the knee is a little further away from us in perspective. How do you show that? Well, she's on a diagonal. She's not on a straight. And this is why I said that finding these angles is really important in the beginning, because it's just going to set you up before you even get detailed with your drawing to have a more realistic drawing going on from the start. You can see I drew a line up from the butt. I was just kind of like checking where that foot lines up. And the easiest way to do that is to just check your reference, apply it to your drawing, steal that angle. It's always there for you to steal. From here, just figuring out a little bit of the rest of the pose. Further driving home that point of perspective, I'm going to make this leg section nice and small. We want to remember that the bottom of the foot too is not going to reach all the way to the bottom of the floor where the knee is necessarily, because it's all the way off into the corner. So again, push that, show it smaller, help the perspective out on this case. Now, something we got to get into this pose is we always have to have our weight bearing, whatever it is, limb, leg. So something I had to get into this pose before my time ran out, and I knew I was running out of time, was that elbow. And so I threw it in really quick, and now this pose looked balanced. Before, it was kind of a mess, but here it is. Last drawing, guys. I hope you've been sticking around. So we got 5 minutes on this one. Take your time a little bit, but trust me when I say this with this pose, that 5 minutes went by like it was a 2-minute drawing for me. I thought I was gonna have so much more time. I was expecting to add so much more detail, but after kind of figuring out this pose and placing some things, I don't know. Time just went away from me. Maybe we'll see in this video where time jumps. I don't know. Maybe I'm a time traveler. I don't think so, but let's focus on the drawing here for a sec. You have a lot of stretching with this pose here. This is a really interesting, dynamic, and different lying down pose than you might have expected to draw, right? So take your time with it. Really let yourself figure it out, find those angles, and you have 5 minutes. Find the halfway point on this one. I know I'm saying stuff like proportions aren't always important when you're doing gesture drawing, but the longer the time you have, the more accuracy you should aim for in your picture if you can. Now, with this one, you can see that really all the way from the beginning of the shoulder to the bottom of the leg, it's just straights for me. This was so I could move through. I'm defining my halfway point there, because if I look over on my picture, I see that the halfway point is about where the shirt ends. So that's something I can use. Again, I said it a few times. I know I'm repeating myself, a broken record here, but use your clothes or the figure's clothes to your advantage. Some of the stuff I was adding there is just kind of like the fabric of the towel on the bench or whatever she's sitting on. And so now to kind of really drive this figure home, I'm adding in some of the arm here. Now, I went a little too high with the arm, but I think it ends up looking okay towards the end. But again, we're just kind of figuring out this pose. I'm already down to 3 minutes, and I feel like I haven't figured anything out here. So we got to keep moving through. Remember to try to get the story down first. What I mean by that is the essentials. How is the pose laying there? You know, make it believable. Right now I have no back or anything going on, so that's something I'm gonna have to come in and figure out now. So I was kind of fixing up that area where I thought the shoulder was a little too high, so I kind of moved the head over a little bit within my drawing, kind of sketched over a little to the side. And now I'm going to add some details that kind of further enforce the figure's perspective and which angle it's lying. So we find in some of that backside. Now we want to remember, with a pose like this, even though everything's getting stretched, there's still a compression going on, and it's going to be that backside because the backside is bending over, which means the top side is getting the stretch. So I still want to emphasize that compression happening in the rib cage, because the rib cage is what's tilting in this picture. From here we go down to our legs, and then we can get in some of that information. Now again, overlapping is important. Overlapping doesn't just happen with the body, overlapping happens with the objects that are in play with the figure as well. So if you can also cover up some, if not more, of the body with that towel or whatever you want hanging there. Of course, you can change whatever they're laying over, and you can cover up some bits and pieces of what's happening here. You don't want to cover up too much, you know, don't overly cheat it because that becomes obvious. But, you know, if, for example, I think I could have covered a little more of the calf than I got to, but just, you know, just a point to kind of think about when you're thinking about that overlap. So another thing to mention is if you look really closely at the picture, you can see the other foot, but it wouldn't really add or make sense in this picture for me to put it there. So I chose to ignore it. Now, maybe if I figured out fully that bench that they're sitting on, the stool bench, maybe I could have thought about adding it, but again, it just didn't really need it. This pose is 100% readable without it. And you kind of want to think about that when you're drawing some poses like this, especially extreme poses. What do you need? What don't you need? All right, as we're coming to the end of this, guys, I just want to say thank you for watching. I know this was a long one. Thank you for sticking it through with me. I'm going to do another video just like this of male figures, so if you want more chances to work on lying down poses, they're coming. Again, if you guys have suggestions for any videos that you want me to make, let me know, and I'll get to those. As always, guys, thanks for watching.